Hello, mind mappers, and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be going over the happiness hypothesis by Johnathan Haidt, putting ancient wisdom and philosophy to the test of modern science. Now, this book is going to be great if you're struggling with happiness in any form. Maybe you're feeling procrastination, maybe you're feeling a lack of motivation, or maybe you're just struggling with sadness on a day-to-day basis. This book is going to be perfect for you because it's simply going to break down some of the ways that we can invite happiness more into our lives, some of the practices, some of the tactics that we can use in order to kind of rewire our brain to be in a happy state more often. Now, before we get into the book, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to Johnathan himself. He's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, and he's written a number of other books. Now, I haven't read any of these books. I read the abstracts while I was reading this one, but he wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, The Righteous Mind, and Flourishing. None of them seem to be on the same topic in particular, but I thought it was very interesting that you saw someone writing about politics actually also write about happiness, and I think that's a very interesting person to be doing this type of a writing. But this book is definitely something that I recommend for any of you who are struggling with happiness in any shape or form. Now, the quote that I pulled out of the book is very long, but it gives you a good overview of what the book is going to be all about. He says, "Where does happiness come from? Well, there are several different happiness hypotheses." Continuing on, he says, "One is that happiness comes from getting what you want, but we all know and research confirms that such happiness is short-lived." Now, this is kind of the studies that you hear about people that win the lottery and, essentially they're at the same level of happiness after 3 or 5 years. That's kind of the thought behind that. A more promising hypothesis is that happiness comes from within and cannot be obtained by making the world conform to your desires. This idea was widespread in the ancient world. Buddha in India and the Stoic philosophers in ancient Greece and Rome all counseled people to break their emotional attachments to people and events which are always unpredictable and uncontrollable, and cultivate instead an attitude of acceptance. So you can see that these are kind of two polar opposite looks at happiness, and yet so many of the books that we've done on this channel and so many of the teachings from some of the great people in the world show us both sides of this coin. Continuing on, Johnathan says in the book, "This ancient idea deserves respect, and it is certainly true that changing your mind is usually a more effective response to frustration than is changing the world. However, I will present evidence that this second version of happiness is wrong. Recent research shows that there are some things worth striving for. There are some external conditions of life that can make you lastingly happier. I'll suggest that the happiness hypothesis offered by Buddha and the Stoics should be amended. Happiness comes from within and happiness comes from without. We need guidance of both ancient wisdom and modern science to get the balance right." So essentially what he's saying, where does happiness come from? Well, it depends. And it depends seems to be the answer to almost every single good question. Johnathan points out here that there are at least two variables to happiness: the internal environment, or essentially how we are thinking and how our thoughts are being used in order to perceive the external environment, and then just the external environment in and of itself, our social connections, our financial health, our physical health. All those things in the external environment matter as well. Now, you might be wondering, which then should we be focusing on, right? So many of the books are teaching us specifically, let's focus on the internal world, or some of them are, teaching us to focus on the external world to be able to try and find our happiness. Well, Johnathan says it depends. Happiness can be best set up by developing both of these environments, which we'll talk about all later throughout the mind map. But honestly, you can ignore either side of the hypothesis at your own peril. If you focus too much on the internal, you can end up being kind of in squalor on the external. And if you focus too much on the external, you can often be at the mercy of that external environment, which, as we've all seen in so many different stories, it is a very, very difficult place to be. Now, let's talk about mind mapping really quickly, a quick introduction to mind mapping. You can get the most out of these mind maps by following along. You can find the process of how I mind map, including my mind mapping software, and all my tips and tricks that I've learned, plus 50+ mind map templates at the link below. Following along will help you learn more, remember better, and you can apply these books better to your life. And with that, let's get into the bulk of the mind map. What I've done is pulled out most of the big ideas from the book. There's 2 ideas that are in black, and I think that those are the most important ideas. I recommend you stick along all the way till the very end so you can get to the final black point. Now, the first point is Freud in a Chariot. He says in the book that Freud said that the mind is divided into 3 parts: the ego, the conscious and rational self; the superego, the conscience, a sometimes too rigid commitment to the rules of society; and the ID, the desire for pleasure, lots of it, and sooner rather than later. Continuing on, he says, the metaphor I use when I lecture on Freud is to think of the mind as a horse and buggy. Think of kind of like a Victorian chariot, in which the driver, which is the ego, struggles frantically to control a hungry, lustful, and disobedient horse, the ID, while the driver's father, the superego, sits in the backseat lecturing the driver on what he's doing wrong. For Freud, the goal of psychoanalysis was to escape this pitiful state by strengthening the ego, thus giving it more control over the ID and more independence from the superego. Now, a quick aside here, I believe, now I'm not super well versed in Freud, but I believe that the ego that Freud is talking about is sometimes also called the higher self, and the superego is actually quite often referred to as the ego in a lot of other teachings, so this can be a little bit confusing. But you can think of this, the ego, kind of as your higher self, and you can think of the superego as something more judgmental that we all have in our minds. Now, continuing on, I like to think of the rider and the chariot as your internal environment, similar to what we talked about before. These characters are all playing a part in the state of your daily being, right? The ID is your laziness, gluttony, and procrastination. As he says here, you can think of it like the hungry, lustful, and disobedient horse. I love that. He also uses a different analogy, which is the elephant, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The superego is all the judgment that you give yourself on those things, and the ego is what you think of as yourself, and is the clear thinking and rational side of yourself, or your higher self. So what I want you to do here is maybe even pause the video. Can you take some time to notice and name each character in your thoughts? Can you see who's popping up the most, and whose voice feels the most powerful? That's a very good exercise to try. It's almost a meditation on the 3 different parts of yourself. The next main point that we're going to be talking about here is training the elephant. The quote from the book goes like this: if you have ever achieved such dramatic insights into your own life and resolved to change your ways or your outlook, you probably found that 3 months later you were right back where you started. Now, this is a very interesting topic, and I think it's something that we definitely need to talk about because so many of us are here reading this book, and it's not going to make a real effect on us unless we actually follow the advice of training the elephant. Continuing on with the quote, he says, epiphanies can be life-altering, but most fade in days or weeks. The rider can't just decide to change and then order the elephant to go along with the program. So you can think of the elephant as that horse, and the rider is obviously your ego or the driver. Lasting change can come only by retraining the elephant, and that's very hard to do. When pop psychology programs are successful in helping people, which they sometimes are, I think that's a little dig at pop psychology, which, it probably is needed. They succeed not because of the initial moment of insight, but because they find ways to alter people's behaviors over the following months. They keep people involved with that program long enough to retrain the elephant. So to me, this is where books and knowledge fail. And you might be thinking, well, this is a guy that has a channel dedicated directly to reading books. Obviously, I'm a big fan of books and of information in general. But when it comes to lasting change, it generally just doesn't cut it. Some of the people close to me think I'm crazy for having coaches in almost each area of my life that I want to improve. But I've come to know through lots of trial and error that no matter how much information I have, quite often I'm simply at the mercy of the elephant. I can know a ton about exercising, I can know a ton about productivity, I can know a ton about business, but I'm often at the mercy of the elephant, no matter how much information I might have. And that's where coaching and accountability are one of the key ways that I personally use to overcome the momentum of that elephant, because the elephant is quite a beast to tame. Now, this might sound weird, but most of my coaching clients actually already know what they want to do. whether they want to grow their business, become more productive, or learn more effectively, the thing that I help them with is simply training the elephant. And this is a very interesting phenomenon where quite often we are willing and able to give ourselves the best advice, but we are unwilling and unable to actually follow it. And that's where coaching comes in. So if you're interested in coaching, you can click the link below to sign up for a sample coaching session. That coaching session is completely free. It's about half as long as what my normal coaching sessions are, but quite often we can make a breakthrough in just that short amount of time. Moving on to our next big idea is about the magic pill. You can see we have 2 different pills coming up. Stay tuned for the other pill. Suppose you read about a pill that could take you that you could take once a day to reduce anxiety and increase your contentment. Would you take it? Suppose further that the pill has a great variety of side effects, all of them good. Increased self-esteem, empathy, and trust. It even improves your memory. Suppose finally that the pill is all natural and costs nothing. Now would you take it? The pill exists and it's called meditation. A lot of you probably knew that was coming. Meditation is one of the most effective ways, along with coaching, to tame the elephant. Quite simply, the elephant acts on impulse. And we all know exactly, sometimes we'll do things like we'll eat something in particular that we didn't want to eat. We'll procrastinate for a long period of time. And we didn't have the intentions of doing any of those things, but instead we were following our impulse. So those impulses quite often can get you off track. They can cause procrastination, overeating, or even emotional outbursts. It just kind of depends on what the impulse is for and what you're kind of naturally wired for. That only works when your ego isn't aware enough to spot that impulse and label it what it truly is. Meditation not only helps you become aware of those impulses, but it'll help you learn how to deal with them effectively. That's why I think meditation is so important. I recommend it to all of you, and I recommend it to all of my coaching clients. Meditation is free, but it's also the best investment that you'll ever make. People who meditate are able to make changes quicker, as well as deal with emotional discomfort more effectively. There's a lot of very simple meditations here on YouTube. You can go and check them out. My personal favorite meditation is just simply to watch all 3 of these kind of parts of my mind start to play on each other. I can notice myself when I'm judging. I can notice myself when I'm being the elephant. And I can notice myself when I'm actually embodying my higher mind. And that quite often is the most effective meditation for me. Not focusing on my breath, but instead focusing on understanding what's going on inside my head. Now, after we get the magic pill, we have one other pill that Johnathan talks about here. He says meditation is characteristically Eastern solution to the problems of life. Even before Buddha, the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu had said that the road to wisdom runs through calm inaction and desireless wanting. Oh, desireless wanting. What a great way to put the state of being that we all would do well to embody, I think. That's something that I definitely am aiming towards, a state of desireless wanting. Western approaches to the problem more typically involve pulling out a toolbox and trying to fix what's broken. That was Lady Philosophy's approach with her many arguments and reframing techniques. The toolbox was thoroughly modernized in the 1960s by Aaron Beck. Depressed people are caught in a negative feedback loop in which distorted thoughts cause negative feelings, which then distort your thinking even further. Beck's discovery is that you can break the cycle by changing the thoughts. A big part of cognitive therapy is training clients to catch their own thoughts, write them down, name their distortions, and then find alternatives and more accurate ways of thinking. Over many weeks, the client's anxiety or depression abates. Cognitive therapy works because it teaches the rider how to train the elephant rather than how to defeat it directly in an argument. Very interesting. It's kind of the opposite side, right? We're just kind of being aware of the elephant, and cognitive therapy is going to do a really good job at showing us how to kind of train that elephant. So cognitive behavioral therapy as a supplement to meditation. Haidt says in the book that if we're feeling down in the dumps, then we should check in on our thoughts. What thoughts are we having right now? How may they be distorted, for example? How might my thoughts be distorted? Or a question that you could ask yourself during meditation, how might this be untrue? So you can kind of unravel it. Because quite often the elephant or even, the super ego, the judgment, will start to take one side in particular. It will say, for example, that you really messed up in this particular situation. then maybe you could go through and you could say, hey, how is this untrue? How was the circumstance? How did I act correctly under that circumstance, or something like that? In other words, how might I challenge this thought? If I'm thinking I'm down in the dumps about some kind of social interaction that I had that I wish I had said something different, how might I challenge this thought? How might I be able to go out and actually make a change to what I had said before? And what might be the correct course of action because of that? Next, we're going to talk about the behavioral part of CBT. It says that instead of laying in bed all day ruminating our thoughts, we should potentially choose to do something small. For example, you could get out of bed and read a newspaper, you could make the bed, you could cook breakfast, something just to get you out of your cycle. Because anyone that has a tendency towards depressive thoughts, of which at times in my life I definitely have had that as well, you seem to get stuck in that cycle. And that cycle kind of starts and then gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And one of the best things that Johnathan talks about here, and one of the best things that I've found, is to just get out of that rumination cycle. Do something very, very small and go ahead and actually take a little bit of action towards something that you want to accomplish. It seems to really kind of break that cycle and at least help you get out of the depression and the sadness for the moment. Next, we're going to talk about the happiness prediction. He says in the book that if you want to predict how happy someone is or how long she will live, and if you're not allowed to ask about her genes or personality, you should find out about her social relationships. Now, having strong social relationships strengthens the immune system. It extends life more than just quitting smoking, speeds recovery from surgery, and reduces the risks of depression and anxiety disorders. It's not just that extroverts are naturally happier and healthier. When introverts are forced to be more outgoing, they usually enjoy it and find that it boosts their mood. Even people who think that they don't want a lot of social contact still benefit from social contact. That's very interesting. So, just a few questions for you, a few questions that I had while I was reading this chapter is, are you investing in long-lasting and deep social relationships? This is something that I find so easy to take for granted. While pursuing my own personal development, I find it easy to isolate myself. Quite often I can spend hours and hours reading, I can spend hours and hours working, and it quite often can lead me to not reaching out and talking to some of my oldest friends, or even having enough time with my family. So how about you? How's your social life? I want you to take some time and maybe even pause the video to ponder this a little bit. I know I tend to think that I don't need much social interaction, but that seems to be proven false. And I can even think back to my own life when I've isolated myself, and that is honestly some of the worst times, is just simply because I haven't been working on my social relationships. So here we have it. We can best serve our own happiness by finding long-lasting and deep relationships. Now, he talks a little bit about in the book as well, about the impact of deep relationships, long-term relationships, relationships that you feel like you can actually have real conversations with people, and then those types of relationships that are kind of surface level and you're just kind of randomly hanging out with the people because you happen to be in the same place. You definitely want to try and foster the deeper relationships if possible. Maybe those with family, long-term friends, or joining groups with similar ideologies. What can you do to work on forging those relationships? Quite often I'll find that hanging out with some of the oldest friends that I have, that feels the most supportive, because we can look back on the past and kind of joke about the past and etc. And then we can also look forward into the future without judging each other about what our goals might be or any of that stuff, which quite often can happen in shallower relationships. Now, our final point, and the final black point, most important point of the book, is the question. He says that I don't believe there is an inspiring answer to the question, what is the purpose of life? Yet, by drawing on ancient wisdom and modern science, we can find compelling answers to the question of purpose within life. Continuing on, he says the final version of the happiness hypothesis is that happiness comes from between. Happiness is not something you can find, acquire, or achieve directly. You have to get the conditions right and then simply wait. Some of those conditions are within you, such as coherence among the parts and levels of your personality. Other conditions require relationships to things beyond you. Just as a plant needs sun, water, and good soil to thrive, people need love, work, and connection to something larger. It is worth striving to get the right relationships between yourself and others, between yourself and your work, and between yourself and something larger than yourself. If you get these relationships right, a sense of purpose and meaning will emerge. So, a few questions that pop up when I read this section of the book. What is the purpose of life, and where can we find happiness? Again, the answer might be, it depends. But here's a good place to start. How is your relationship with your thoughts? How are your relationships with the people around you? And what might you do to improve in those areas? All of these questions, plus many more inside the book. I recommend that you pick this book up. It definitely was well worth the read. You could perhaps even check it out on Audible at the link down below. These are the types of questions that coaching can be extremely helpful for. So if you find yourself struggling with any of these types of questions or with any of the problems that we described here in the book, I recommend that you go down to the link below, sign up for a free sample coaching session. It's about half as long as my regular coaching sessions and completely free. I'd be happy to help you work through any and all of these problems or anything else that you might be dealing with. Thanks for being with me here today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This was The Happiness Hypothesis by Johnathan Haidt.